So, Chapter 262 of JJK is finally out after a 2-week hiatus. And surely a ton happened, right? I mean, Gege had 2 weeks to cook up this masterpiece of a chapter. Absolutely. The chapter is 20 pages long. The fight between Yuta and Sukuna reaches its conclusion. And oh yeah, Rika's back with Yuta. 2 of those things were a lie. 1 was the truth. Because, well, yes, technically Rika is back with Yuta in a sense. The chapter was not 20 pages long. In fact, it was 7 pages long, and the fight between Yuta and Sukuna has basically barely progressed. Now, while this might sound like a worst-case scenario,
oh, we waited 2 weeks for this chapter?
Not only is Gege apparently not feeling good, according to his author notes. Let's say I'm not feeling the best right now. My condition is a bit bizarre. Sorry for the various inconveniences. But also in the course of these 7 pages, which is about half the length of your usual chapter, a fair bit does actually happen. And while the biggest developments that happen do definitely revolve around Rika and her now full manifestation, we're also beginning to retread into what was one of the most complicated things for your average JJK reader to try and experience, which was the battle of domains between Gojo and Sukuna. See, I'm gonna come out and say it. Well, sometimes the complication of the JJK power system does lend to incredible writing. Unfortunately, when it comes down to high-level battles of domains, they're usually too complicated for your average casual enjoyer of JJK, which actually is a big reason of why I'm making today's video. So usually a 7-page chapter wouldn't necessitate a whole manga chapter breakdown. However, because of the combined facts that Rika is now fully manifested and the possible plot implications of that down the line, and the fact that we're treading back into one of the more complicated topics in the entirety of JJK, I figured it'd be best if I broke down this chapter and did a little refresher course on the Gojo versus Sukuna Clash of Domains. And at the end of that refresher course, we'll talk about Rika being fully manifested and what that might mean for this continued battle against Sukuna. So while technically not much might have happened in this chapter, we definitely got enough to talk about. But before we get to talking about anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me breaking down all the anime and manga news you could ever want, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, Chapter 262, also known as the decisive battle in the uninhabited, demon-infested Shinjuku. The chapter that was supposed to truly kick off the reigniting of the flame of the battle between Gojo and Sukuna. And while, in a sense, it did technically do that, unfortunately, because of Gege's current health complications, we didn't get nearly as much of the battle as we originally anticipated. But we did still get some very decisive and very important moments. So, let's get into it. Chapter 267 picks up exactly where Chapter 266 left off. Fortunately, there was no flashbacks or Hikari x Urame in this chapter because in the scope of 7 pages, there really wasn't much time for that. That being said, the chapter opens with both Gojo and Sukuna opening their domains, which all but guarantees that Yuji and Todo will not be involved in this battle, which is... It's great if you ask me. It's just great. Super sound logic. Now, the reason that Yuji and Todo will not be involved in this battle is because Yuta is following in the footsteps of Gojo. That is to say that Yuta watched Gojo battle against Sukuna, and by swapping his brain into Gojo's body, he got all of Gojo's memories. And thus Yuta, through his watching experience of the first battle and the fact that he's now living inside of Gojo's body, knows that the way that Gojo eventually figured out how to win the Battle of Domains against Sukuna is that Gojo had to shrink his unlimited void all the way down to the size of a basketball. And by decreasing the effective range of his domain expansion, he's able to make the outside of his domain expansion hard. See, for those of you who don't remember, the law of domain expansions is either they're usually really hard to get into or really hard to get out of. At least this is domain expansions with a barrier technique added to them. Now, usually the law of domain expansions is that they're very hard to get out of. This is why when Yuji beat down on the outside of Mahito's first ever self-embodiment of perfection domain expansion that he used against Nanami, Yuji was able to break into Mahito's domain expansion. And thus the issue that Gojo, not Gota or Yujo, which one are we calling him? I like Yujo, but Gota is also pretty good. Actually, I like Gota better. But the problem that Gojo's having against Sukuna in their initial clash of domains, like 30 chapters ago, was that the effective range of Sukuna's domain expansion is so massive that there was no chance his unlimited Unlimited Void would be able to encapsulate it all. And because of this, Sukuna was able to attack the outside of Unlimited Void with his Malevolent Shrine attacks, which would then lead to the subsequent breaking down of Unlimited Void. Now, this is because Sukuna's domain expansion doesn't have a barrier attached to it, so its effective range is 200 meters, which is much, much vaster than the effective range of Unlimited Void. However, since technically domain expansions are like kind of pockets of reality, kind of like reality marbles in Fate, you can shrink down 2 humans into a domain the size of a basketball, and they'll still have a fair amount of room to run around. However, since Risk is inherently a massive additive in strength for a curse technique in JJK, like it is for a Nen technique in Hunter x Hunter, if Gojo were to shrink the effective range of his domain expansion down to that of a basketball, he would be able to make the outside of his domain expansion much sturdier, but not infinitely sturdy. See, Sukuna's countermeasure to this is decreasing the range of Malevolent Shrine to only be a couple of inches bigger than said basketball, which allowed for Sukuna to expend as little cursed energy in his own domain expansion as possible, and also possibly increase the power of the slashes associated with his guaranteed hit factor, which are now attacking the outside of the Unlimited Void domain expansion. Now, in the circumstance where Gojo or Gota uses this basketball-sized domain expansion, it's able to survive the onslaught of Malevolent Shrine for 3 minutes, which means within the capacity of those 3 minutes, Gojo has to inflict enough damage on Sukuna that Sukuna can no longer maintain the Malevolent Shrine on the outside of his domain expansion, at which point Sukuna would be hit by Unlimited Void, which would probably do enough damage to him that it would shut him down, considering how much damage has been done to him at this point in the fight. Now, it's while all of this is being told to us that it's revealed that this isn't Yuta's first time in Gojo's body. As Yuta says, all of the switch training that I did with Gojo using Wee Wee's technique allowed me to elevate my barrier technique too, meaning that the second person that Wee Wee actually switched wasn't Yuji with Yuta, it was Yuta with Gojo, at least so far as I can confirm. Oh wait, no, I've reread it. Wee Wee can switch the same person twice in 1 month, which means that Yuji switched with Yuta and Kusakabe to learn Reverse Curse Technique and Simple Domain, and Yuta switched with Gojo and Yuji. Like, I just reread the last 6 chapters of this manga, which is way more than I actually needed to read, because Wee Wee doesn't reveal the whole soul switching thing until 3 chapters ago, and there's literally nowhere in any of these chapters that it's ever said that Yuji and Yuta switched bodies. So if somebody knows something that I don't, could you tell me in the comments below? Because a couple of chapters ago, everybody was breaking down the chapter being like, it's confirmed that Yuji and Yuta switched bodies, and I simply cannot find it. Anyways, Wee Wee's able to switch one person's soul twice a month, which is how Yuta would have been able to switch with Gojo, even if he also switched with Yuji, who also switched with Kusakabe. Got it? Good. We're literally 2 pages in. Oh, and if anybody's wondering as to whether or not this 3-minute mark is even going to matter because Sukuna is only able to maintain his domain expansion for 99 seconds, don't worry, that rule's gone. But Nick, why is that rule gone? Well, because Sukuna has decreased the effective range of his domain expansion to only be bigger than a basketball, which means he can now maintain his domain expansion indefinitely. But what's super fun and not aggravating at all is that Sukuna's plan over the next 3 minutes is to break down Gota in a battle so severely that they drop Unlimited Void, so that Sukuna can then expand the range of Malevolent Shrine to eviscerate everybody outside of the basketball, which means Sukuna would have Malevolent Shrine open for 3 minutes, and then he would make Malevolent Shrine the standard size. And knowing Gege, he'd probably just once again have his domain expansion indefinitely. Like, his plan is to re-expand the range of Malevolent Shrine in 3 minutes. Mind you, he like just opened Malevolent Shrine and used Divine Flame to scorch a 200-meter radius of Shinjuku like 4 minutes ago. And over the course of those 4 minutes, he was just repeatedly being punched by Yuji, which should have made him substantially weaker. And yet over the course of those 4 minutes, when he wasn't supposed to be able to use curse techniques, he like just simply kind of could. And now without the ability to use reverse curse technique, he's once again opened his domain expansion with the idea of expanding it back to its original range.
But Nick, it's smaller now.
The entire reason that Gojo and Sukuna could rip back-to-back domain expansions in their first battle was because they were were actively using reverse curse technique on the part of their brain that controls curse techniques. So like currently, rules just don't apply to Sukuna, but rules haven't applied to Sukuna in like 7 chapters. And the next page is just a full page of Gojo and Sukuna's faces looking at each other, talking about what their plans for the next 3 minutes are. Goto wants to damage Sukuna to the point where he drops Malevolent Shrine so that he's hit with Unlimited Void, and Sukuna's plan is exactly what I just laid out for you. He wants to beat down Goto to the point where Unlimited Void drops and he can expand his range of Malevolent Shrine to kill the rest of the Kusakabe Coalition. It's at this point that the real fun begins, as Goto begins to spark up a blue with the idea of pulling Sukuna to him so that he can start the fisticuffs. But Sukuna decides to save him the effort and simply just flash steps up to Goto, using his 2 amputated arms to hold down Goto's right arm, and using his bottom right arm to land an incredibly hard punch to Goto's chin. Now this sends Goto reeling, because so far as Yuta knew, Sukuna wouldn't be able to punch him on account of Infinity, because the only way that Sukuna would be able to bypass Infinity would be domain amplification. But Nick, what's domain amplification? Great question. It's kind of like a domain expansion. See, domain amplification is kind of like a domain expansion, but only applied to your fists. And instead of filling your domain with an innate technique like you do with a domain expansion, you expand an empty domain, kind of like a simple domain. Now, technically, within the confines of a domain expansion, domain amplification shouldn't be possible, at least if you were to go by the traditional JJK letter of the law manuscript on how things work. Why, you ask? Well, because the amplification of one's domain stops one from being able to use their innate technique. That is to say that if you amplify your domain by adding hollow domains onto each of your fists, if you were somebody like Sukuna, you'd no longer be able to use Cleave or Dismantle or Divine Flame. And while one would assume that this would apply to a domain expansion, it doesn't. See, because a domain expansion has an innate technique applied to it, but it's not technically you doing the active application of it, and thus you're able to maintain a domain expansion and a domain amplification simultaneously, which I really don't think you should be able to do, because to me a domain expansion falls under the categorization of an innate technique, but I'm not writing the manga. On top of this, the fact that Goto didn't know that this was a possibility from Sukuna also makes me a little bit angry, because Kenjaku's ability gives you all the memories of the person whose body you're taking over, and thus Goto should know that Sukuna specifically can use domain amplification inside of a domain expansion, because this is not the first time he's done it to Gojo's body. And thus, within this 3-minute battle, Sukuna technically can't use his innate techniques like Cleave and Dismantle and Divine Flame. Sukuna does have the ability through domain amplification to make contact with Gojo's actual body. And I was kind of lying earlier when I said that Sukuna can't use Cleave and Dismantle, because he absolutely can. Because Sukuna can very easily switch between innate technique and domain amplification. However, Cleave, Dismantle, and Divine Flame won't affect Goto because of the Infinity. And therefore, Sukuna's only real 2 courses of action are either the world-cutting slash or domain amplification fisticuffs. And since Sukuna hasn't slowed down, even though we've been told he's slowed down multiple times, has both of these options very open to him. Sukuna then laughs about Goto not knowing he can amplify his domain within a domain expansion, because he says naturally what happens within a domain can't be observed by Mei's crows, which I would once again like to super reiterate is not the only way that Yuta would know what happened in the battle against Sukuna. In fact, one could argue that's the least reliable bit of information he could be relying on right now. But what do I know? I just study this manga for a living! And by the way, it feels important to note here that Yuta's copy curse technique is only applicable for 5 minutes at a time, which means that if Kenjaku's body swapping type is either an intermittent type or a constant type, meaning that it either requires a constant input of the innate technique to keep a body under its control, or it needs a shot of cursed energy to keep the body under control every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 1 week, 1 month, that this one battle that falls within these 3 minutes is really going to be Yuta's only chance at defeating Sukuna. Well, at least that's the situation with Kenjaku's curse technique being a constant type. If it is a constant type, the second that those 5 minutes are up, Goto's body's just going to go limp. If it's an intermittent type, Goto's body will go limp whenever it needs to put in cursed energy again to keep control over Gojo's body, which could be a week from now. We legitimately have no way of knowing. But if I had to put my money on legitimately anything, I'd reckon this chance Goto has against Sukuna is probably the only chance he'll get. But then again, I could be wrong, because while this one punch between Sukuna and Goto is all we get in terms of their battle, the last page of this chapter is rather interesting. See, the last page of this chapter reveals a couple of crucial things to us as it pertains to Yuta's future. And all of those things revolve around Rika. See, after this simple exchange of fists between Gota and Sukuna, we cut to a fully manifested Rika who's holding on to Yuta's body, crying and calling his name out. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. The real, most interesting reason being that Rika is fully manifested. But what does that mean? Well, let's quickly go over what Rika is and how they've been existing for the entirety of the JJK manga up until this point. See, Rika is a special grade vengeful cursed spirit. Now, a vengeful cursed spirit is a specific and interesting type of cursed spirit. See, a vengeful cursed spirit is a human who becomes a cursed spirit because their death was cursed. And those who have their deaths cursed and are therefore corrupted in the process of death become vengeful cursed spirits. Now, this doesn't happen often because those who would usually end up turning into vengeful cursed spirits, sorcerers, are usually killed through jujutsu. However, since Rika wasn't killed with jujutsu and Yuta couldn't accept her death, therefore cursing it, ended up creating Rika as a vengeful cursed spirit. Now, the reason that Yuta is so powerful is because his ancestor was Michizane Sugawara, who became one of the big three vengeful spirits. On top of this, the Sugawara were the ancestors of the big three sorcerer families, the Zenin, the Gojo, and the Kamo. However, it was recently revealed in literally chapter 260 that Yuta might have also had ancestors from the Fujiwara clan, who were the arch enemies of the Sugawara clan and also ancestors to some of the most powerful sorcerer clans that exist today. And thus Gojo actually believes that Yuta was born under a luckier star than even he was, which is most likely why Yuta was able to create such an incredibly strong vengeful cursed spirit in Rika. Now, let's talk about Rika. Rika has been identified as a special grade ever since she was created. In fact, it's said that Rika's penchant for destruction is unmatched in not only the Jujutsu world, but also amongst other cursed spirits. She also has an immeasurable amount of cursed energy, and this presumably limitless amount of cursed energy allows her to manifest literally any cursed technique, which is where Yuta's ability Copy comes from. All this was before Rika even achieved her true final form. See, after Yuta agreed that after death that they would be together, Rika's eye opened, which was the manifestation of the true peak of her power, which gave her access to her pure love beam, which was able to overpower a maximum Uzumaki being fired by Geto. Now, if you've been reading the manga, you'll have realized that Rika's eye hasn't been opened for a while. In fact, it hasn't been opened since JJK 0. However, rather interestingly, the reason that she was able to open her eye and get access to this level of power in the first place is the binding vow that Yuta made to give his life to her so that they could spend their lives together in the afterlife, which raises a couple of interesting possibilities. See, it's specifically stated in JJK 0 that a fully manifested Rika would give Gojo trouble, and this is why Geto was so incredibly keen on acquiring Rika in the first place, as Rika is fully considered the queen of curses, one of, if not the strongest cursed spirit on the planet. Now, Yuta, with time after JJK 0, was able to fully manifest Rika, but they were still inherently tied together at that moment in time, and thus there's a possibility that the full manifestation that Yuta was using with Rika wasn't her actual full manifestation, but that's a theory at best. But the only reason I bring up that theory is because the ending of chapter 261 very clearly states Rika fully manifested, however, ... Now, calling Rika fully manifested in this moment is a bit odd to me. I just realized I've been calling this chapter 261 the entire time. It was 262. Now, the reason that we're talking about Rika being fully manifested here is either to enunciate the fully part, or to simply hammer home the fact that Rika is gonna stick around even without Yuta. Or, Rika still existing in her fully manifested form shows us that Yuta still has all of his cursed techniques in Gota's body. And really, these are the three biggest possibilities. Either Rika gets to exist by herself as a fully manifested cursed spirit with strength on par with that of Sukuna, and if that's the case, we have to take into consideration the possibility of Yuta's death and what that might mean for the binding vow that he made to her, or Rika still being fully manifested proves that she is, in fact, one of Yuta's cursed techniques, which would imply over the course of the next 5 minutes that Yuta should be able to, in Gojo's body, to use Rika in the battle against Sukuna, which would mean the second possibility for Rika's future is that if Yuta dies, so does she. Now, the third possibility for Rika's future, or the third reason that she was shown at the end of this chapter, is to show us that Yuta Yuta still has access to his cursed techniques, like Rika and Copy and True Mutual Love and Thin Icebreaker, and most importantly, Kenjaku's body swapping technique. And this third possibility might be the most likely possibility because the second biggest takeaway from this scene of Rika holding Yuta's body is the fact that she's not holding two halves of Yuta's body. See, we can see very clearly that Yuta's body is once again whole, which means that Yuta most likely got the Shoko experience of having his bisected body put back together post-mortem. So if he switches back into his own body, he can maximize his reverse curse technique output and heal his body like he did with Gojo. And Rika still being around and essentially being a cursed energy battery for Yuta to tap into whenever he needs implies that if that switch were to happen, he would have enough cursed energy to do so. Now, the fleshing out of what Rika's full manifestation could mean for the plot of JJK moving forward for both Yuta and Rika requires its own video. And it's gonna be the next video I post on this channel, because the sheer amount of theories that could spin out of this one possible panel are almost endless. And we're already 20 minutes into this video. On top of that, the last bit of news that was conveyed with chapter 262 is the fact that we're not getting more JJK for 3 whole weeks. And I need things to talk about. So I'll catch you on the next one. But before we get there, I'm curious to hear from you guys. How did you feel about chapter 262? Do you believe that Yuta can bounce back from his brain swapping vacation? What do you think's going on with Rika's full manifestation? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Ooh, I just remembered I gotta film a reaction to MHA's new chapter.